On February 28, 1945, a medical evacuation report filed at Clark Airfield in the Philippines contained an anomaly that would remain buried in archived documents for decades. The report, stamped with routine administrative markings, documented the treatment of 17 Japanese civilian women found in a bombed-out hospital in Manila. What made this document unusual was not the presence of enemy civilians in an Allied medical facility, but rather the handwritten notation in the margin, "Patient Identification Protocols suspended by order of Sergeant O. Carter, Canadian Women's Army Corps." The notation appeared unremarkable to anyone reviewing the paperwork in 1945. Standard wartime medical procedures allowed for enemy wounded to receive treatment under the Geneva Convention. However, archived correspondence discovered in 1943 revealed that Sergeant Olivia Carter had submitted multiple requests to modify identification procedures for Japanese civilians, requests that had been consistently denied by her commanding officers. The discrepancy between official policy and the marginal notation would later raise questions about what exactly occurred in that Manila hospital during the final weeks of the Philippine campaign. Sergeant Carter's service record, microfilmed and stored at Canadian Military Archives in 1944, showed her assignment to the 3rd Medical Unit supporting operations in the Southwest Pacific. Born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, she had volunteered for overseas service in 1942 after completing nursing training at the University of Manitoba. Her personnel file contained standard commendations for efficiency and dedication, but also included 2 disciplinary letters regarding unauthorized deviation from established medical protocols. The specific nature of these deviations was never detailed in the available documents. The 17 Japanese women referenced in the evacuation report had been discovered during the liberation of Manila's Santo Tomas Hospital on February 26, 1945. According to combat reports from the 37th Infantry Division, the hospital had been heavily damaged by artillery fire and abandoned by both Japanese military personnel and most Filipino staff. When American troops entered the building, they found the women huddled in a basement storage room, apparently having survived on medical supplies and rainwater collected through holes in the damaged roof. Among the women was 22-year-old Keiko Nakamura, daughter of a Japanese medical administrator who had been stationed in Manila since 1942. Her father's employment records, found in the hospital's partially destroyed administrative offices, indicated that the Nakamura family had been living in staff quarters when the battle for Manila began. Keiko's own medical training, documented in forms written in both Japanese and English, showed she had been working as a trainee nurse under her father's supervision. What remained unclear from the available documentation was how she and the other women had become separated from the Japanese evacuation of the hospital. The medical unit's daily operational logs for February 27th showed routine entries documenting the arrival of wounded American soldiers and Filipino civilians. However, the entry for 1400 hours contained an unusual notation: 17 female Japanese civilians admitted for medical observation. Special handling protocols implemented. The log did not specify what these protocols entailed, nor did it identify who had authorized their implementation. Subsequent entries for the following 3 days made no further mention of the Japanese women, despite standard procedure requiring daily updates on all patients under military medical care. Sergeant Carter's personal effects, inventoried after her transfer to a medical facility in Australia in April 1945, included a leather-bound diary with entries spanning her entire service in the Philippines. The diary, written in pencil and occasionally damaged by tropical humidity, contained detailed observations about medical procedures, supply shortages, and interactions with Filipino civilians. However, the entries for February 27th through March 2nd showed signs of pages having been carefully removed. The remaining stub edges suggested that 5 full pages had been torn out with deliberate precision. A letter, dated March 15, 1945, found among Carter's correspondence, was addressed to her sister in Winnipeg, but was never mailed. The letter, discovered decades later still sealed in its envelope, contained passages that seemed to reference her experiences with Japanese civilians. You cannot imagine how wrong our assumptions have been about these people. What we expected to find and what we actually encountered were 2 entirely different things. I have seen fear in its purest form, and it has nothing to do with guilt or defiance. The letter's remaining content focused on routine matters of military life and family news. The official medical records for the 17 Japanese women documented their physical condition upon admission to the Allied facility. All showed signs of malnutrition and dehydration, consistent with several days without adequate food or water. However, the medical notes also recorded symptoms that seemed inconsistent with their physical circumstances. Elevated heart rate, trembling, and what the examining physician described as extreme defensive posturing when approached by male medical personnel. An administrative memo, dated March 1, 1945, addressed to the commanding officer of the 3rd Medical Unit, requested clarification on current protocols for enemy civilian medical care. The memo, signed by Major William Torres, the unit's chief medical officer, specifically asked whether special accommodation procedures recently implemented by nursing staff had proper authorization. 3 of the women, including Keiko Nakamura, presented with minor injuries from falling debris during the artillery bombardment of the hospital. The response to this memo, if one existed, was not found among the archived documents. Major Torres's own service record indicated he was transferred to a different medical unit on March 8, 1945, 10 days earlier than his originally scheduled rotation. Keiko Nakamura's medical file contained a handwritten note dated March 3, 1945, that appeared to be in Sergeant Carter's handwriting based on comparison with other documents. The note stated, "Patient demonstrates progressive improvement in responsiveness to medical staff. Initially exhibited signs of severe psychological distress when approached for routine examinations. Responded positively to modified approach utilizing female-only medical contact." The note concluded with an observation that seemed unusual for a military medical record. Patient appears to have expected significantly different treatment than provided. The evacuation records for all 17 Japanese women showed they were transferred to a civilian internment facility near Manila on March 5, 1945. The transfer documentation listed their physical condition as stable and noted that they had been cleared for standard civilian detention procedures. However, a routing slip attached to the transfer papers contained a handwritten request from Sergeant Carter asking that the women be assigned to a facility with adequate female supervision and medical staff. This request appeared to have been denied, as the destination facility was staffed primarily by male guards and had no dedicated medical personnel. Among the archived materials was a partial transcript of what appeared to be an interview or interrogation session. The document, labeled Civilian Information Gathering Female Detainees, was dated March 4, 1945. The transcript included responses from someone identified only as Subject N, believed to be Keiko Nakamura, based on age and background information that matched her medical file. When asked about her family's activities in Manila, Subject N's responses were recorded as brief and factual. However, when questioned about her experiences with American medical personnel, her responses became more detailed. They treated us like sick people, not like enemies. We did not understand why. We expected punishment, but they gave us food and medicine. The transcript continued with Subject N, describing the Japanese women's initial reaction to their capture. "We thought the soldiers would hurt us because that is what we were told would happen. My father said American soldiers were cruel to Japanese people. But the woman soldier was kind. She spoke to us gently and made sure we had blankets." The interview appeared to have been conducted with a Japanese interpreter, as several responses were noted as translated approximately in the margins. The transcript ended abruptly, with no indication of why the interview was not completed. A supply requisition form dated February 28, 1945, showed unusual requests for items not typically associated with military medical operations. The form, signed by Sergeant Carter, requested additional blankets, female undergarments in various sizes, and what was listed as comfort items for female patients. The requisition was initially denied by the supply officer with the notation, "Inappropriate use of military resources for enemy personnel." However, a second copy of the same form bore an approval stamp dated March 1st, with a different officer's signature authorizing the request. The medical unit's radio communication logs for early March contained several messages that seemed related to the treatment of Japanese civilians. A transmission sent on March 2nd included the phrase, "Request guidance on extended medical care protocols for female civilian detainees." The response, received several hours later, was brief. "Follow standard Geneva Convention procedures. No special accommodations authorized." However, a follow-up message sent the same day asked for clarification on female-specific medical requirements, suggesting that standard procedures were somehow inadequate for the situation at hand. Sergeant Carter's efficiency reports for February and March 1945 contained conflicting assessments. Her immediate supervisor, a Canadian nursing officer, praised her exceptional dedication to patient care under difficult circumstances and noted her innovative approaches to complex medical situations. However, a report filed by Major Torres described Carter's performance as adequate but sometimes exceeding authorized protocols. The discrepancy between these evaluations was never resolved in the available documentation. A letter from the Canadian Women's Army Corps headquarters, dated March 20th, 1945, informed Sergeant Carter that she was being transferred to medical duties in Australia, effective immediately upon completion of current assignments. The letter cited the need for experienced medical personnel in rear area facilities, but the timing of the transfer, coming just weeks after her involvement with the Japanese civilians, raised questions about the actual reasons for her reassignment. Carter's response to this transfer order, if any was written, was not found among the archived documents. The final reference to the 17 Japanese women in available military records appeared in a weekly summary report dated March 10th, 1945. The report, compiled by the military government office responsible for civilian affairs, noted that 17 Japanese female civilians previously under medical care had been successfully integrated into the standard civilian internment population. The report made no mention of any special circumstances surrounding their initial treatment or any ongoing medical needs. This summary would be the last official documentation of their status found in archived materials. Years later, a collection of personal letters written by Filipino hospital workers who had remained in Manila during the Japanese occupation surfaced among documents donated to a local historical society. One letter, written by a Filipino nurse named Maria Santos, described her experiences when American forces retook the Santo Tomas Hospital. Santos wrote to a relative, "The American nurses were very gentle with the Japanese women they found. I was surprised because I thought they would be angry with them. But one of the nurses, I think she was Canadian, she treated them like they were her own patients. She even learned some Japanese words to make them feel safer." Santos's letter provided additional context that had been missing from official military records. She described how the Japanese women had been discovered not just hiding in the basement, but actively caring for several wounded Filipino civilians who had been trapped in the hospital when the fighting began. According to Santos, the women had been using their limited medical knowledge to treat injuries and had been sharing their remaining food supplies with the other civilians. This information was not reflected in any of the military reports about the discovery of the women. The letter also described Santos's observations of Sergeant Carter's interactions with the Japanese women. The Canadian nurse spent extra time with them. Even though her officers told her to focus on the American soldiers, she would sit with them during her breaks and try to talk to them. She found out that one of them, a young woman named Keiko, could speak some English. After that, she used Keiko to help communicate with the others. Santos noted that this arrangement seemed to make the other women more comfortable during medical examinations and treatment. Among the papers found in Sergeant Carter's personal effects was a small notebook containing what appeared to be basic Japanese phrases written in English phonetic spelling. The phrases included medical terms like medicine, pain, and help, but also more personal words like safe, friend, and understand. The notebook showed signs of frequent use, with some pages worn from handling. This suggested that Carter had made a deliberate effort to communicate with the Japanese women in their own language, despite the language barrier and the fact that they were officially classified as enemy civilians. A report filed by the military chaplain assigned to the 3rd Medical Unit mentioned an unusual request from Sergeant Carter for guidance on appropriate religious considerations for non-Christian patients. The chaplain's response, documented in his weekly summary, indicated that Carter had asked about Japanese religious practices related to illness and death. This inquiry seemed to stem from her concern that the medical treatment provided to the Japanese women might conflict with their cultural or religious beliefs. The chaplain noted that he had provided general information about Japanese customs, though he admitted his knowledge was limited. The discovery of these various documents painted a picture of events that differed significantly from the official military narrative. While the formal reports treated the discovery and treatment of the Japanese women as a routine medical operation, the personal correspondence and unofficial observations suggested a more complex situation. The documents indicated that both the Japanese civilians and their American captors were operating under assumptions about each other that proved to be inaccurate when they actually interacted. Keiko Nakamura's experience, as reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence, appeared to challenge the expectations on both sides of the conflict. She and the other Japanese women had apparently been told to expect harsh treatment from Allied forces, while the medical personnel had been prepared to deal with potentially hostile or uncooperative enemy civilians. Instead, they found frightened, injured people who responded gratefully to medical care and basic human kindness. The administrative confusion evident in the various reports and memos suggested that the military bureaucracy was not well equipped to handle situations that fell outside standard operating procedures. The treatment of enemy civilians, who were neither combatants nor prisoners of war, but simply people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, created policy questions that individual officers had to resolve without clear guidance from higher command. Sergeant Carter's apparent decision to modify standard protocols seemed to have been based on her professional assessment that the Japanese women required different treatment than what was normally provided to enemy personnel. Her efforts to learn basic Japanese phrases and to accommodate their cultural needs suggested a level of personal investment that went beyond routine medical care. However, the subsequent administrative actions, including her early transfer and the removal of pages from her diary, indicated that her superiors may have viewed her approach as problematic. The ultimate fate of the 17 Japanese women remained unclear from the available documentation. The record showed only that they were transferred to civilian internment, with no further information about their conditions during the remainder of the war or their eventual repatriation to Japan. Keiko Nakamura's story, like those of her companions, disappeared into the broader sweep of wartime displacement and chaos that affected millions of civilians throughout the Pacific Theater. The documents that survived provided glimpses of individual human experiences within the larger context of military operations. They suggested that even in wartime, when people were officially designated as enemies, personal interactions could transcend those categories. The fear that Keiko and the other women initially experienced, based on what they had been told to expect from their captors, gave way to relief and gratitude when they encountered treatment that contradicted those expectations. For Sergeant Carter and the other medical personnel, the encounter with the Japanese civilians seems to have challenged their own preconceptions about the enemy. The professional medical training that emphasized treating all patients with care and dignity apparently took precedence over military classifications when they were faced with actual people in need of help. The tension between official policy and individual humanitarian impulses created the administrative complications that were evident in the confused and sometimes contradictory documentation. The medical unit's daily routines continued around these events, with wounded soldiers arriving and departing, supplies being managed, and reports being filed. The presence of the Japanese women was just one element in the larger operation of providing medical care in an active war zone. However, the special notations, unusual requests, and administrative inquiries suggested that their presence created ripple effects that extended beyond the immediate medical care they received. The geographic setting of these events, in the ruins of Manila during the final phase of the Philippine campaign, provided a backdrop of destruction and chaos that affected everyone involved. The Santo Tomas Hospital, where the women had been discovered, was just one of many civilian facilities that had been damaged or destroyed during the fighting. The broader civilian population, including both Filipinos and Japanese, was struggling to survive in a city that had become a battleground. The timing of these events, in February and March of 1945, occurred as the war in the Pacific was entering its final phase. The Japanese military was conducting increasingly desperate defensive operations, while Allied forces were advancing toward Japan itself. In this context, the encounter between Canadian medical personnel and Japanese civilian women represented a small, personal dimension of the larger historical forces that were reshaping the region. The archived documents, with their bureaucratic language and fragmentary information, provided only partial insight into the human experiences they recorded. The official reports focused on procedures, protocols, and administrative requirements, while the personal letters and diary entries revealed the emotional and psychological dimensions of the encounter. Together, they suggested a story that was more complex than either a simple narrative of military efficiency or humanitarian triumph. The language barrier between the Japanese women and their Canadian caregivers added another layer of complexity to their interactions. Sergeant Carter's notebook of phonetic Japanese phrases represented her attempt to bridge this gap. But the limited vocabulary she could master meant that much of their communication must have relied on gestures, tone of voice, and basic human compassion. The fact that Keiko could speak some English made her a crucial intermediary, translating not just language, but also cultural understanding between the two groups. The medical treatment provided to the Japanese women appeared to follow standard procedures for civilian casualties. But the documentation suggested that Sergeant Carter and her colleagues had to adapt those procedures to address the specific psychological trauma that resulted from the women's expectations of harsh treatment. The note about extreme defensive posturing and the gradual improvement in their responsiveness indicated that their initial fear was based on genuine expectations of abuse or violence. The contrast between what the Japanese women expected and what they actually experienced seemed to be a source of confusion for both sides. The women's apparent surprise at being treated as patients rather than prisoners suggested that they had been prepared for a very different kind of encounter with Allied forces. Similarly, the medical personnel may have expected to deal with hostile or uncooperative individuals, rather than frightened civilians who responded gratefully to basic care. The administrative response to Sergeant Carter's modifications of standard protocols revealed the institutional tensions inherent in military medical operations. The medical mission of caring for all patients conflicted with military security requirements and resource limitations. Carter's requests for special accommodations were initially denied, but the eventual approval of some requests suggested that her superiors recognized the legitimacy of her professional judgment, even if they were reluctant to establish precedents for special treatment of enemy personnel. The transfer of the women to civilian internment marked the end of their time under direct military medical care, but it also represented a return to the standard categorization that officially defined them as enemy aliens. The documentation provided no information about whether the insights gained from their time in the medical facility influenced their subsequent treatment in the internment camp. The request for adequate female supervision and medical staff at their destination facility suggested ongoing concern for their welfare. But the denial of this request indicated that institutional priorities took precedence over individual humanitarian considerations. The broader historical context of the Pacific War included numerous instances of cultural misunderstanding and mutual fear between different populations. The encounter in Manila represented one small example of how direct personal contact could challenge the stereotypes and expectations that had been shaped by propaganda and wartime nationalism. The fact that both sides initially operated under false assumptions about the other illustrated the power of these preconceptions to influence behavior and expectations. The role of women in this encounter added another significant dimension to the story. The fact that Sergeant Carter and her colleagues were female medical personnel may have been crucial in overcoming the Japanese women's initial fear and defensiveness. Cultural factors related to gender roles and the specific vulnerabilities of women in wartime situations may have influenced both the initial trauma and the eventual development of trust between the two groups. The preservation of these documents in military archives meant that the story remained buried for decades, known only to the individuals who had participated in the events and the few officials who had access to the classified files. The fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence suggested that much of the story had been lost or deliberately removed, leaving only partial insights into what had actually occurred. The removed pages from Sergeant Carter's diary represented the most obvious example of information that had been suppressed or destroyed. The geographic displacement of the individuals involved meant that any follow-up on these events would have been difficult, even if there had been official interest in doing so. Sergeant Carter's transfer to Australia removed her from the Philippine theatre while the Japanese women's placement in civilian internment separated them from the medical personnel who had cared for them. The end of the war and the subsequent repatriation of Japanese civilians would have scattered the participants across different countries and continents. The medical unit's continued operations meant that the events of late February and early March became just one episode in a longer sequence of wartime medical missions. New patients arrived, different challenges emerged, and the administrative focus shifted to other priorities. The special circumstances that had required modified protocols for Japanese civilian women were not likely to be repeated, so the lessons learned from this experience may have had limited application to subsequent operations. The personal impact on the individuals involved remained largely undocumented in the official records. Sergeant Carter's later career, her memories of the encounter, and her reflections on the experience were not recorded in any files that survived in the archives. Similarly, the subsequent lives of Keiko Nakamura and the other Japanese women, their memories of their time in Allied medical care, and their perspectives on the treatment they received were not preserved in any discoverable documentation. The contrast between official policy and individual initiative that characterized these events reflected broader tensions within military organizations during wartime. While regulations and procedures were necessary for maintaining order and discipline, they could not address every situation that arose in the field. The judgment and creativity of individual personnel, like Sergeant Carter's modifications to patient care protocols, often determined the actual implementation of policy in specific circumstances. The question of whether the special treatment provided to the Japanese women represented appropriate humanitarian care or unauthorized deviation from established procedures remained unresolved in the available documentation. The conflicting evaluations of Sergeant Carter's performance suggested that different officials had different interpretations of her actions. The subsequent administrative actions, including her transfer and the apparent suppression of some documentation, indicated that her approach was controversial within the military hierarchy. The cultural learning that occurred during this encounter appeared to have been mutual. Sergeant Carter's efforts to learn basic Japanese phrases and understand Japanese customs suggested that she recognized the importance of cultural sensitivity in providing effective medical care. Meanwhile, the Japanese women's experience of receiving compassionate treatment from enemy personnel may have challenged their own assumptions about American and Canadian attitudes toward Japanese people. The timing of these events, near the end of the war, when American forces were preparing for the invasion of Japan itself, gave them additional significance. The treatment of Japanese civilians in the Philippines could have provided insights relevant to planning for the occupation of Japan, where American forces would encounter millions of Japanese civilians. However, there was no evidence in the available documents that the lessons learned from this small-scale encounter were systematized or communicated to higher command levels. The medical aspects of the encounter highlighted the universal nature of human suffering and the medical profession's commitment to treating all patients regardless of their political or national affiliations. The Geneva Convention requirements for treating enemy wounded reflected international recognition of this principle, but the situation with civilian women, who were neither combatants nor formal prisoners of war, created legal and procedural ambiguities that had to be resolved by individual medical personnel. The psychological trauma evident in the Japanese women's initial responses reflected the broader impact of wartime propaganda and mutual demonization on civilian populations throughout the Pacific conflict. Both sides had been conditioned to view the other as fundamentally different and threatening, making the development of human empathy and understanding more difficult. The breakthrough that apparently occurred in this case suggested that direct personal contact could overcome some of these barriers, but only under specific circumstances that allowed for extended interaction and mutual vulnerability. The documentation of these events in various military files demonstrated the bureaucratic complexity of wartime operations, where individual human encounters had to be recorded, classified, and processed through multiple administrative systems. The survival of some documents and the apparent destruction of others reflected the different priorities and perspectives of various officials who controlled access to information. The pattern of preservation and suppression suggested that some aspects of the story were considered more appropriate for historical record than others. The role of interpreter services in facilitating communication between the Japanese women and their Canadian caregivers highlighted another dimension of cross-cultural encounter during wartime. The availability of personnel who could speak both languages was crucial for moving beyond basic gesture and emotional communication to more detailed understanding of needs and concerns. Keiko's role as an informal interpreter gave her additional importance within the group and may have influenced her own experience of the encounter. The supply and logistics aspects of caring for the Japanese women revealed practical challenges that went beyond immediate medical treatment. The request for female undergarments and comfort items indicated recognition that psychological well-being required attention to dignity and personal needs that were often overlooked in military operations. The initial denial and subsequent approval of these requests reflected institutional learning about the requirements for effective care of this population. The interaction between military medical personnel and civilian patients in a combat zone illustrated the complexity of maintaining professional medical standards under wartime conditions. The medical staff had to balance their professional obligations to provide care with military security requirements and resource limitations. The modifications to standard protocols that Sergeant Carter implemented represented her professional judgment about what was necessary for effective treatment, but they also created administrative complications that reflected institutional tensions. The geographic setting of Manila in early 1945 provided a unique context for this encounter, as the city was transitioning from Japanese to American control while dealing with extensive damage from urban combat. The civilian population included people with complex loyalties and relationships that did not fit neatly into the categories of friend and enemy that guided military operations. The Japanese civilian women represented one element of this more complicated social reality that military personnel had to navigate. The preservation of personal letters and diary entries alongside official reports provided multiple perspectives on the same events, revealing how different participants understood and remembered their experiences. The official documentation focused on administrative and procedural concerns, while the personal writings revealed emotional and psychological dimensions that were not captured in formal reports. This contrast illustrated the limitations of official records as sources for understanding the full human impact of wartime encounters. The medical training and professional background that Sergeant Carter brought to her encounter with the Japanese women may have been crucial in shaping her response to their needs. Her nursing education had emphasized patient care as the primary mission, potentially creating a framework for decision-making that prioritized humanitarian concerns over military classifications. The tension between these different value systems appeared throughout the documentation of her actions and their administrative reception. The absence of follow-up documentation about the long-term outcomes for either the Japanese women or the medical personnel involved reflected the chaotic nature of wartime record-keeping and the rapid pace of events during the final months of the Pacific War. Personnel transfers, unit reorganizations, and changing priorities meant that individual cases could easily disappear from official attention, even if they had been significant for the people directly involved. The cross-cultural learning that occurred during this brief encounter represented a microcosm of larger processes that would become important during the post-war occupation of Japan. The insights gained about Japanese civilian responses to American treatment, the importance of cultural sensitivity in building trust, and the role of individual initiative in overcoming institutional barriers could have informed broader policies for managing civilian populations. However, the apparent suppression of some documentation suggested that these lessons may not have been systematically preserved or transmitted. The gender dynamics of this encounter added another layer of complexity to the cross-cultural communication that took place. The fact that both the caregivers and the patients were women may have facilitated trust and understanding in ways that would not have been possible in interactions between men and women from opposing sides in the conflict. Cultural factors related to gender roles, family relationships, and women's experiences of war may have created common ground that transcended national boundaries. The administrative confusion evident in the various reports and memos reflected the broader challenge of managing civilian populations during active military operations. Standard procedures had been developed for dealing with enemy combatants and friendly civilians, but situations that fell between these categories created policy questions that had to be resolved by field personnel without clear guidance. The improvised solutions that emerged from individual initiative could later become sources of institutional learning, but only if they were properly documented and analyzed. The timing of these events in relation to the broader Pacific War meant that they occurred during a period of transition when American forces were shifting from offensive operations against Japanese positions to preparation for the occupation of Japan itself. The treatment of Japanese civilians in liberated areas like the Philippines could provide valuable experience for managing much larger civilian populations in Japan. However, the documentation suggested that the institutional mechanisms for capturing and applying these lessons were inadequate. The personal relationships that developed between individual medical personnel and Japanese patients during this encounter represented a form of diplomacy at the most basic human level. While formal diplomatic relationships between nations remained hostile, the actual interactions between people on opposite sides of the conflict created possibilities for understanding and mutual respect that transcended official categories. These personal connections could not change the larger political and military realities, but they could influence how individuals understood their experiences of war. The medical ethical principles that guided treatment decisions during this encounter reflected international standards that recognized the fundamental human dignity of all patients, regardless of their political affiliations. The implementation of these principles in a military context required individual medical personnel to navigate between their professional obligations and institutional requirements that might conflict with patient care. The documentation suggested that these tensions were not easily resolved through existing policies and procedures. The linguistic challenges of providing medical care across language barriers highlighted the importance of communication in building trust and understanding between people from different cultural backgrounds. The notebook of phonetic Japanese phrases that Sergeant Carter compiled represented her recognition that effective care required more than just medical procedures. It also required the ability to communicate reassurance, explanation, and human compassion in terms that patients could understand. The logistics of housing and caring for 17 additional patients in a military medical facility during active operations created practical challenges that went beyond immediate medical needs. The requests for additional supplies, female supervision, and special accommodations reflected recognition that standard military arrangements were not adequate for this population. The administrative responses to these requests revealed institutional priorities and resource limitations that constrained individual humanitarian initiatives. The documentation patterns evident in this case reflected broader military practices for recording and preserving information about operations involving enemy personnel. Some aspects of the encounter were thoroughly documented through multiple report systems, while others appeared to have been deliberately suppressed or destroyed. The survival of fragmentary evidence suggested that complete reconstruction of events would be impossible, leaving significant gaps in understanding what actually occurred. The psychological impact of this encounter on all participants remained largely undocumented in the official records. The Japanese women's initial fear and gradual development of trust represented one dimension of this impact, while the Canadian medical personnel's challenge to their own assumptions about enemy civilians represented another. The long-term effects of these experiences on individual attitudes and behavior could not be assessed from the available documentation. The institutional memory of this encounter appeared to have been deliberately limited through personnel transfers and document management practices that prevented systematic learning from the experience. Sergeant Carter's early transfer removed the primary innovator from the unit, while the missing diary pages eliminated her personal record of events. These actions suggested that institutional priorities favored maintaining standard procedures over preserving insights that might challenge established policies. The broader historical significance of this encounter lay not in its immediate impact on military operations, but in its illustration of possibilities for human understanding that could transcend the political and cultural divisions that characterized wartime relationships. The documentation provided evidence that even in circumstances of extreme conflict, individual encounters could create spaces for mutual recognition of shared humanity. However, the apparent suppression of some aspects of the story suggested that institutional systems were not well equipped to preserve or learn from these insights. The clearest indication of what actually transpired during those crucial days in March 1945 emerged from an unexpected source discovered in 1944. A maintenance log from Clark Airfield, filed among routine engineering reports, contained a brief entry dated March 6. Medical tent number 7 requires additional structural support due to extended occupancy beyond standard capacity. The notation appeared unremarkable until cross-referenced with other documents, revealing that Tent 7 had been designated for overflow patient housing during the period when the Japanese women were under medical care. This maintenance record, combined with supply requisitions for extended bedding and the repeated requests for female supervision, suggested that the 17 women had remained under medical observation for significantly longer than indicated in official transfer documents. The discrepancy raised questions about whether their eventual transfer to civilian internment had been delayed, and if so, why standard procedures had been modified without proper documentation. A final piece of evidence appeared in a casualty report filed on March 8, 1945. Among routine listings of wounded personnel transferred to rear area facilities was a single entry. Sergeant O. Carter, Canadian Women's Army Corps, transferred for medical evaluation, exhaustion and nervous strain. The report indicated that Carter had been evacuated to a hospital in Brisbane, Australia, just 3 days after the official transfer of the Japanese women to civilian internment. The timing of Carter's medical evacuation suggested a connection to the events involving the Japanese civilians, though the exact nature of this connection remained unclear from available documentation. Exhaustion and nervous strain were common diagnoses for military personnel who had served extended periods in combat zones, but Carter's assignment to medical duties rather than frontline combat made this diagnosis somewhat unusual for her circumstances. No further records of Sergeant Olivia Carter's military service were found in archived Canadian military files. Her personnel record ended with the notation of her medical evacuation, with no indication of whether she recovered from her condition or returned to active duty. The absence of additional documentation suggested that her military career had ended with her transfer from the Philippines, though the specific circumstances of her discharge were not recorded in available files. Similarly, no additional information about Keiko Nakamura or the other 16 Japanese women was discovered in post-war records. The civilian internment facility where they had been transferred was decommissioned at the end of 1945, and its records were either destroyed or transferred to repositories that could not be located decades later. The women's subsequent repatriation to Japan, if it occurred, was not documented in any discoverable archives. The Santo Tomas Hospital, where the women had originally been discovered, was rebuilt after the war and continued operating as a civilian medical facility. However, institutional memory of wartime events appeared to have been deliberately suppressed, with no commemorative markers or historical displays acknowledging what had occurred during the Japanese occupation or American liberation. The basement storage room, where the women had taken shelter, was converted to standard hospital use, with no indication of its wartime significance. In the decades following the war, occasional references to unusual encounters between Allied personnel and Japanese civilians appeared in veterans' memoirs and oral history projects. However, none of these accounts specifically mentioned the events involving Sergeant Carter and the 17 women. The story remained buried in archived documents that were not systematically reviewed until historical researchers began examining wartime medical records in the 1970s and 80s. The fragmented nature of the surviving documentation meant that crucial questions about this encounter remained unanswered. The extent to which Sergeant Carter's modifications of standard protocols had been officially sanctioned, the reasons for the apparent suppression of some records, and the long-term impact on both the medical personnel and Japanese civilians involved could not be determined from available evidence. What emerged clearly from the archived materials was evidence of a brief period when military classifications and enemy designations had been temporarily set aside in favor of basic human compassion. The encounter between Canadian medical personnel and Japanese civilian women had challenged assumptions on both sides and created possibilities for understanding that transcended the official categories that governed wartime relationships. The administrative confusion and institutional tensions revealed in the documentation reflected broader challenges faced by military organizations when confronted with situations that did not fit standard procedures. Individual initiative and professional judgment had provided solutions to immediate humanitarian needs, but these innovations had not been systematically preserved or incorporated into institutional learning. The story of Keiko Nakamura and Sergeant Olivia Carter remained incomplete, preserved only in fragments of bureaucratic paperwork and personal correspondence that had survived decades of archive management and institutional reorganization. Their brief encounter during the chaotic final months of the Pacific War had apparently made a significant impact on both of their lives, but the full dimensions of that impact would remain forever undocumented. The archived materials that preserved this story represented a small fraction of the millions of individual human encounters that occurred during World War II. Most of these interactions were never recorded at all, while others were documented only in official reports that focused on operational rather than personal dimensions of wartime experience. The survival of enough fragmentary evidence to reconstruct even a partial narrative of this encounter was itself remarkable. The silence that surrounded these events in post-war documentation reflected broader patterns of institutional memory that emphasized official narratives while suppressing accounts that complicated established interpretations of wartime experience. The story of humanitarian treatment provided to enemy civilians challenged simple narratives of national conflict and suggested the persistence of individual moral agency even under extreme circumstances. Years later, military historians would note that the Pacific War had involved millions of civilian casualties and displacement across multiple countries and cultures. Within this vast scope of human suffering, the encounter between 17 Japanese women and a Canadian medical unit represented just one small example of how individual actions could create islands of compassion within larger contexts of organized violence. The documentation that survived suggested that both Sergeant Carter and Keiko Nakamura had been changed by their brief interaction during those crucial days in Manila. However, the specific nature of that change and its impact on their subsequent lives remained beyond the reach of historical reconstruction. The final entry in the available records appeared in a post-war administrative summary filed in 1946. The report, reviewing medical operations in the Philippines during 1945, contained a single paragraph noting that standard protocols for enemy civilian medical care had proven adequate for all situations encountered. The statement made no mention of modified procedures, special accommodations, or the various administrative complications that had characterized the actual treatment of Japanese civilians. This official conclusion represented the institutional desire to maintain consistency in procedures and policies, even when individual cases had required significant deviations from standard practices. The bureaucratic preference for clean narratives had effectively erased the complexity and humanity of actual wartime encounters, leaving only fragmentary evidence buried in archived documents that would remain unexamined for decades. Until today, these records remain sealed in military archives, their contents known only to researchers who have painstakingly reconstructed this narrative from scattered bureaucratic fragments. The complete story of what occurred between Canadian medical personnel and 17 Japanese women during the liberation of Manila may never be fully understood, but the surviving evidence provides glimpses of human dignity and compassion that transcended the official categories of wartime conflict. The echo of these events continues to resonate in the silence of archived documents, where individual names and personal experiences remain trapped within bureaucratic language that could never capture the full human dimensions of their wartime encounter. The story of Sergeant Olivia Carter and Keiko Nakamura survives not as a complete narrative, but as a reminder that even in the midst of organized violence, individual human choices could create moments of understanding that challenged the assumptions and expectations that defined official-enemy relationships.